Who were the first economists? Or, to put it another way, even if they did not know it, who were the first theorists to begin to study these spontaneous orders in scientific terms? The answer is very simple. The great jurisconsults of the classical Roman period. They were the first to realize that law was a spontaneous order, the result of an evolutionary process. We even have documentary evidence. For example, in his work De Republica, Cicero states Cato, the great theorist of the Roman Republic. We read the following. According to Cicero, Cato points out that Roman jurists were already aware that Roman law was not the personal creation of one man, but of many, over generations and centuries. Here is the exact quote. There never was in the world a man so clever as to foresee everything, and that even if we could concentrate all brains into the head of one man, it would be impossible for him to provide for everything at one time, without having the experience that comes from practice through a long period of history. The great theorists of Roman law were independent professionals. They were not government officials. Whenever a legal conflict arose, the individuals involved would turn to them for advice and for defense in the corresponding lawsuits. These jurisconsults did not attempt to be original or clever. Instead, they sought to discover the logic inherent in legal categories and institutions, or if you prefer, the fundamental principles which shape the rules that govern the behavior of human beings. Jurisconsults like Papinian, Paul, Ulpian, Gaius, and Modestinus. They did not know it. If we could get into a time machine and travel back to their era and ask them, "Are you economists?" they would say, "Are you crazy? Econo what? I am a jurist." But they were economists because they thought and studied and realized and discovered something the Greek philosophers had been incapable of discovering, no matter how smart and wise they were. Aristotle, Socrates, Plato. In fact, just the opposite. The great Greek philosophers completely overlooked the spontaneous market order. They did not understand it. They looked down on merchants. They laughed at and ridiculed entrepreneurs' sons who wished to continue working in their father's workshops. They admired social engineering and the dictatorship of Sparta versus the relatively freer spontaneous order of Athens. The Romans have generally been criticized as unoriginal and accused of having relied on the great philosophical, artistic and technical contributions of the Greeks. But certainly in the sphere of law and in the sphere of economics, the original ones were the Romans, and the ones who failed were the Greeks. In fact, the law, as a set of behavioral guidelines, did not exist in written form for centuries and centuries. Jurists asked questions, researched and analyzed, and it was there. There was no need to write it down, because it was there in the logic of human nature and human interactions. It was only very late in history, when the Western Empire had fallen into the hands of barbarians and the Eastern Empire was in danger, that an Eastern emperor, Justinian, feared that those legal principles and rules would be forgotten. And for the first time, he decided, and this was soon after the year 500, in the first quarter of the 6th century, he decided to have the law put in writing, so that it would not be lost. And since the 16th century, that law code has been known as the Corpus Juris Civilis. But until that very late period in history, the law did not exist in written form, because there was no need to write it down. We could say it was written metaphorically in gold letters, in our very nature, and jurists simply had to discover, refine, interpret, and apply to concrete cases principles that were already known. It was as if someone said, "Let us record the essence of human nature." Listen, that is not necessary, because human beings are there in the flesh, walking, existing, living, acting, creating. We need only analyze them. Well, the chapter we are commenting on from my book, Money, Bank Credit and Economic Cycles, concludes with a study of the principles, according to Roman law, which govern the monetary irregular deposit contract. Ulpian very clearly states that to loan is one thing, and to deposit is another. In the digest, it is plainly stipulated in several places that someone who receives a good on deposit and uses it instead of guarding and keeping it constantly available to the depositor is guilty of the crime of theft. which natural law prohibits. And you will see the distinction jurists make in the case of a banker who goes bankrupt. They distinguish between depositors and people who have made loans at interest to the bank, and they state that the former have absolute priority over the latter. The two contracts are radically different. According to Ulpian, if I make a deposit at the bank, I have absolute priority. But if I make a loan to the bank in exchange for interest, that is another matter, and I have no priority if my banker goes bankrupt. Ulpian distinguishes between two contracts that are radically different, even if they are made with the same person: the deposit contract for safekeeping and the loan contract. And finally, a brief reference should be made to the so-called depositum confessatum. If a depository, whether of wheat, oil or money, appropriates the good and uses it for his own business deals, he is a criminal, and he has committed the crime of misappropriation, theft under Roman law. And furthermore, apart from all the penalties he faces as a criminal, he is obliged to return the good with interest, and rightly so. For a number of reasons, and without any basis, the three monotheistic religions prohibited loans at interest. In fact, the Catholic Church retracted, and in the 19th century, lending at interest ceased to be a sin. How many people died thinking they were going to hell, when lending at interest is actually an innocent transaction? And because a society cannot function without interest, all sorts of subterfuge were sought, and one method was to disguise the loan as a deposit, since charging interest was prohibited. So, before a notary, people would state that they were making a deposit. Well, as you know, excusatio non petita, accusatio manifesta. There is no need to declare an obvious truth. It's like when you come in the door and your child says to you, "Dad, it wasn't me," and you haven't asked him anything. Then you know he's guilty. Something has happened and he is guilty. Well, a person who solemnly declared before a notary, "This is a deposit," was not making a deposit, but since being caught making a loan would cost him his life, and not only this life, but the next as well, he had to declare that it was a deposit, and he would conspire with the depository. The depositor would say, "Listen, please do not return my deposit. A year from now, I will ask you for it. And since you will be sentenced to pay interest, you can pay me the interest." And what was really a loan was disguised as a deposit in which the contract was violated. Take note, because this is important. For 1,000 years, confusion has existed between the two institutions, and it stems from a historical accident, the canonical prohibition of usury. When the distinction between the two institutions became blurred, the situation became more favorable to the emergence of fractional reserve banking, in violation of general legal principles, as we will see, and also more favorable to the emergence of the current state of affairs, which provokes credit expansion, malinvestment, financial crises, and economic recessions. Minor historical causes produce major and extremely destructive effects, and even today we are still suffering from these.